Welcome. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I am delighted to host this program with a returning speaker, one of my favorites, Dr. Beverley Eddy. She's returning with more insights on the intelligence training during World War II. Those of you who are World War II buffs probably know her book, The Ritchie Boys' Secrets. It's subtitled, How a Force of Immigrants and Refugees Helped Win World War II. That book delved into the specialized intelligence training of 15,000 men and women at Camp Ritchie in the mountains of northern Maryland. And then in an earlier program that she'd presented to the Adams County Historical Society, Bev shared stories of the women intelligence officers who were trained at Camp Ritchie. If you want to watch that earlier program, it is on YouTube now, and it is entitled Ritchie Girls and Ritchie Wax. Today, however, she's sharing the stories from Camp Sharpe, which is a part of the Camp Ritchie operation, but it was located on the battlefield here in Gettysburg. In this presentation, Bev is going to talk about not only the people who came to Camp Sharpe, but she has found out exactly how they were trained, what they studied, what methods they used. She's done an amazing job of researching their curriculum, and a great deal of it came from interviewing the veterans themselves and making their stories come alive. Was she successful in this? Let me share some words of praise for her Camp Sharpe book. And this comes from the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the U.S. Army, David Fry. Professor Fry said of her, quote, "What Dr. Eddy, a German linguist who did not train as a historian, has done is masterfully demonstrate how creativity and innovation, diversity, and sometimes disorder helped to spawn the birth of new forms of warfare. That warfare, developed and employed by the Psycho Boys of Camp Sharpe, helped to save lives and speed the defeat of Nazi Germany." End quote. So with that high note, let me turn the program over to Dr. Beverley Eddy.
Everybody knows that Gettysburg was a Civil War battlefield. This was not lost on Stefan Heim, a young German Jewish refugee from Hitler's Germany, after he had become an American citizen, joined the Army, and been assigned to study military intelligence at Camp Ritchie. One day he was called out and reassigned with other Ritchie boys to its sub-camp located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he wrote, quote, "You get accustomed to a lot of things in an army, but this had a stupid flavor all its own, placing men you want to send into future battles among the dead of a battle past. Oh, Gettysburg." And, indeed, on November 1st, 1943, there began a flow of U.S. Army men into that area of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania's hallowed ground, now identified as McMillan Woods. Their mission was highly secret, but it soon became clear that these were not your typical soldiers. They were older than your average rifleman, a large percentage of the men were Jewish, many were foreign-born, and all were fluent in at least 2 languages. Most belonged to 4 special units called mobile radio broadcasting companies, and were sent to Gettysburg for an intensive training program in propaganda services and psychological warfare. They would play a substantial role in the conquest of Germany. It was at the secret camp and military intelligence training at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, that the first mobile radio broadcasting company, or MRB company, had been formed for service in North Africa and in the Italian campaign. Under the command of Major Edward A. Caskey, this experimental psychological warfare unit had joined forces with experts in British propaganda in a highly successful campaign that proved this psychological warfare was, quote, "one of the most important supporting weapons of modern warfare." And it was because of this success that the Army recalled a 32-year-old lieutenant named Hans Habe from his assignment with the 1st MRB Company and assigned to him the task of training 4 more MRB companies for the Allied invasion of France. Habe was an extremely colorful, and some would say controversial figure. He was a Hungarian by birth and a newspaperman by trade. Even before America's entry into the war, he had proved his abilities on the battlefield as a volunteer in the French army. He had been captured, imprisoned, and later, with the help of French friends, escaped from a German transit prison camp in Lorraine, France. Habe had emigrated to America, quickly become an American citizen, and turned his prison camp experiences into a best-selling work. In 1942, Habe married Eleanor Post Hutton, heiress of General Foods. It was his 3rd marriage, her 4th. Eleanor Post Hutton's stepfather, Joseph Davies, had served as American ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1937 to 1938. Through the spectacular success of his novel, the wealth of his wife, and the political clout of his new father-in-law, Habe became a prominent figure on the Washington social scene. When his wife gave birth to their son, Anthony Nicholas Habe, Eleanor Roosevelt served as godmother. At Habe's meeting with his superiors in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1943, everyone quickly agreed that the secrecy of the Army's mission could best be preserved by moving the MRB candidates to a camp devoted solely to psychological warfare. As one of the members of the 2nd MRB Company, a Czech filmmaker named Hannes Borger, would tell it, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania's, quote, admittedly somewhat decaying Camp Sharpe became Habe's sandbox, given him to do exactly as he wished. As Habe confirmed, I was furnished with full powers that many a general might have envied. I was allowed to pick from the superbly organized card indexes of the War Department those men whom I considered suitable for the task in hand, and within 48 hours the people thus chosen would arrive at Gettysburg. Until November 1943, the camp on the edge of the Gettysburg battlefield was known only as CCC Gettysburg II. It had housed an all-black unit of civilian Conservation Corps members who had been brought in to clear the battlefield of brush, build bridges, roads, and outbuildings, and, in general, beautify the battlefield before and after the 1938 Civil War Veterans Reunion and the dedication of the Peace Light. These quarters had been vacated in March 1942. In November 1943, the Gettysburg newspapers reported that the abandoned camp had been converted into a small army camp, and that this, quote, local camp, a temporary setup, has been named Camp George H. Sharpe in memory of General George Gordon Meade's intelligence officer during the battlefield of Gettysburg. The exact nature of the camp could not be determined. It was much more secret even than the training camp at Camp Ritchie. Nobody was allowed to visit the camp, not even the wives of the soldiers stationed there. And it was, quote, surrounded by such secrecy that it was not even connected by telephone. For this reason, there are no Army photographs that were taken at Camp Sharpe. The only photographs allowed at the camp were class photos and class entertainments. There are no pictures of Camp Sharpe that show instruction, exercise, vehicles, and weapons, or even parade formations, and no one, even at Camp Ritchie, was to be informed of what was going on at Camp Sharpe. The first men to come to Gettysburg were not part of Habe's training program, however. They were men who had already been trained in military intelligence at Camp Ritchie and were now being sent to Gettysburg for concentrated ranger training in a more secret and separate locale. These men were being trained to be dropped behind German lines, and their physical training went far beyond the normal military exercises of the average GI. One of its members, Gunter Kosse, remembers that their selection for this mission was somewhat unusual. About 60 of the Ritchie men were simply called out one day and told that they should pack their basic equipment, take their weapons, and prepare for a 20-mile march. They arrived at the former CCC camp on November 1st. Kosse remembers that there was already snow on the ground. Here they lived the rough life of rangers and were given strenuous physical training, which took advantage of the battlefield in all kinds of weather. Often these were forced marches at night, meaning that the men had to travel 7 miles an hour with a full pack and rifle. Private Kosse was struck by these nighttime marches, illuminated only by moonlight, among the statues of Civil War soldiers and generals. The men also learned how to take apart machine guns and put them back together again under the worst of condition, when the guns were frozen, for example, and when they themselves were blindfolded. After some weeks, these men were shipped off to Northern Ireland for further training, and the 2nd MRB Company took their places in the Camp Sharpe barracks. Many of those eventually selected for the 4 MRB companies would go through some training at Camp Ritchie before transferring to Sharpe. Others, with greater experience behind them, would be directly reassigned to Sharpe from other locations and other duties. The author, Albert Girard, would be brought to Camp Ritchie from his present Army assignment in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was studying Japanese. Sergeant Phil Pinkowski was operating radios at Camp Ashby in Virginia when he and 2 fellow soldiers were called up to Gettysburg. Corporal Edward Alexander applied to the MRBs from the U.S. Army Signal Corps and was then sent to Boston University for an intensive crash course in German before his transfer to Gettysburg. As one company historian put it, dozens of radio technicians, German-speaking personnel, and drivers began to pour in from camps throughout the country. Everyone, from the average doughboy to commanding officers to the company members themselves, agreed that the men of the MRB companies were an unusual lot. The German writer Stefan Heim, for example, was the author of the best-selling novel Hostages that had recently been made into a Hollywood film. Boris Kremenliev was a Bulgarian-born composer and musicologist with a Ph.D. from the Eastman School of Music. The Czech author Josef Vexberg was a columnist for The New Yorker and an authority on gastronomic matters. Tony Strobel was a Disney artist who had worked on Fantasia, Pinocchio, and Dumbo. The Russian-born Count Igor Cassini was a prominent gossip columnist. Walter Kohner and Fred Lawrence had been successful stage actors in Austria. Among the members of the 2nd Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company, 143 men and 21 officers, 33 languages were spoken, although German and French were dominant. The regular Army, in fact, would refer to the men of the MRBs as a unit of geniuses, although some of the troops abroad also referred to them as psycho boys and thought they were medics. The Camp Sharpe men also referred to themselves as psycho boys, and because of the high percentage of Jews in training in Gettysburg, the men stationed at Camp Sharpe frequently referred to it as Camp Shapiro. As one of the first of the MRB transferees into Gettysburg, the Henry James scholar Leon Edel expressed his dismay upon arriving at Camp Sharpe on January 3, 1944. Quote, "We were parked in a muddy hollow at the bottom of a slanting road. The barracks were filled with dust and cobwebs, and the windows looked as if mud had been smeared across them. Mice and rats had left their deposits. The MRB men were not used to the harsh living conditions that the Rangers had endured at Camp Sharpe. The novelist Stefan Heim found the barracks to be more like hovels than dwellings, in, quote, different stages of scantily painted-over decay. The barracks were surrounded by a sea of mud. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls, while 4 stoves tried in vain to keep up the room temperature. Major John T. Jarecki was the camp commander, but it was Lieutenant Hans Habe who dictated the training program. The company personnel was organized into sections: headquarters, radio, propaganda, printing, and motor pool. Depending on previous experience, training at Sharpe could last from 1 week to 3 months. Quote, as training proceeded, the separate sections soon became expert in their jobs. The radio men disappeared inside their rigs to master their equipment. The printing section, made up of skilled craftsmen, got the feel of their mobile equipment and grew accustomed to working in confined quarters. The motor pool was busily engaged in the never-ending task of maintenance and care of the company's vehicles, which ranged from jeeps to huge 10-ton semi-trailers. They also waterproofed all these equipments for the landing at Normandy. Most of the best-known authors, professors, actors, and filmmakers were assigned to the propaganda section. Here, all the men trained for a variety of assignments. Some might be sent to film or take photographs in the battle zone for purposes of propaganda and documentation. Some would broadcast in different languages to local populations as well as to the German army. Some would serve as translators and interpreters. Some would interrogate prisoners and civilians. Some would monitor German and civilian radio and newspaper in order to gauge morale. Some would produce propaganda pamphlets, posters, and leaflets in record time for the changing war conditions. And some would have the most dangerous task of hog calling. This involved driving out in front of the Allied lines to speak directly to the German soldiers through microphone and urge them to surrender. Despite this possibility of future specialization, all were to be instructed in all techniques of propaganda, and Hans Habe was the main instructor. Classes were held in barracks that had been set up with brand-new desks and a large blackboard next to the teacher's table, and the soldiers were each given a supply of fresh notebooks and pencils. As the men sat there, waiting for something to happen, suddenly, quote, someone appears like a comet, sparkling, glides past them along the center aisle, stops before the blackboard, turns around slowly towards the men who are watching him in astonishment, and informs them who he is. First Lieutenant Hans Habe de Bekesy, returned from Africa. The men were all amazed and amused by Habe's appearance. Contrary to Army regulations, Habe's hair was dyed chestnut brown with blonde tints, so that the men began, behind his back, to refer to him as Goldilocks. In addition, Habe was undoubtedly the best-dressed officer in the U.S. Army, end quote. Each day, Habe followed the same pattern of entering the classroom from the rear, walking to the front of the room, pausing in front of the blackboard, and then swinging around to face his students. The ritual was deliberate. Despite his heroism on the battlefield and his brilliance as an interrogator, he was, at heart, an actor and a fop. Peter Weidenreich commented that, quote, it was like perpetually being at a show, at a circus, just to see this guy perform. I would have paid money for it. Leon Edel was also amused by Habe's speech. He revealed a strange mix of Anglo-French words and expressions. I'm here, he said, to tell you some dopes. He spoke of changement and groupment. He told us how many innumerable things he had to cover, and he was forced to condensate. Having condensated, he offered a few additional datas. Stefan Heim recalled that, quote, Habe's manner of speaking was fascinating. His somewhat squawking nasal voice did not allow his listeners to shut down, however tired they were, and the powerful gaze of those large, bright, slightly protruding eyes always seemed to demand some reaction to his assessments, desires, and challenges. In spite of his deliberate flamboyance and his unusual manner of speaking, Habe was an effective instructor who won the grudging admiration of the worst skeptics. Filmmaker Hannes Borger noted, quote, "He was amazing. Not only did he slip with no apparent difficulty from one role to another, it would not have surprised us if he had changed clothes and makeup in every one of our short breaks, like a quick change artist in a vaudeville theater. He was by turns German teacher, journalist, radio director, political lecturer, copy editor, language teacher, voice trainer, psychology professor, whatever the course material demanded." 50-minute classes with a 10-minute break between them were held each day from 9 to 5. One set of lectures was on interrogation. Habe treated this extensively. He taught the Sharpe boys how to evaluate whether a prisoner was going to be tough or easy to crack. As a rule of thumb, he said, the easiest prisoners were first Poles, then Yugoslavs, then Germans. Enlisted men, then non-commissioned officers, then officers. But there were frequently exceptions to this. Interrogators must be patient and develop techniques for determining who among the German prisoners were likely to be tough or easy. He also taught men the various psychological techniques that were effective when questioning difficult German officers. He suggested that interrogators first ask a few military questions to which they already knew the answers. Quote, "This will give the prisoner the satisfaction of refusal. You will then supply the answers yourself, thereby showing your knowledge and easing his mind on the point of military security. The officer will feel that this military information is the real objective of your interrogation. From this point on, the interrogation may turn to the not strictly military subjects that you are really interested in, and the significance of which German officers rarely appreciate." At the end of the lectures, the Camp Sharpe participants were called upon to do practice interrogations under the watchful eye of Habe and their classmates, who then critiqued their performances. Another important aspect of the training at Camp Sharpe was radio monitoring. "The monitor is a news reporter," Habe told his men. "It is his job to listen to news broadcasts and to report them as faithfully as possible. He must train himself to listen patiently and to record quickly and accurately what he hears." Since most of the men did not know shorthand, Habe taught them a cue word system to use in its place. It is similar in nature to the acronyms and abbreviations many people use today in their texting. The men could turn their abbreviations back into words and work them into complete sentences when the broadcast was over. It was necessary for the men to have complete mastery of personal and geographic names as well as cue words in order to be effective monitors. Their work had to be accurate. Monitors were not to editorialize, but to make their reports as comprehensive as they were able. They were not to skip any news item, however unimportant it might appear. The chief monitor would then arrange the monitor's reports by classifying them as allied, enemy, or neutral news stories. Then he would index them and write a page of personalities in the news and another of highlights in the news. These reports would be mimeographed and distributed to all the writers on their team for print or radio. Many of the Sharpe soldiers found monitoring radio broadcasts to be one of their most difficult tasks. All in the propaganda division were required to take several turns at preparing a report based on news broadcasts available in Gettysburg. The men also learned how to use the chief monitor's reports in other propaganda venues. For example, broadcasting teams, each made up of an editor, scriptwriters, announcers, and producer, learned how to prepare news broadcasts based on monitor reports. The scriptwriters rewrote them to make them suitable for 15-minute broadcast news segments. They were trained to keep their sentences short, use adjectives sparingly, and keep the language simple. Habe taught the men an interesting technique for holding the interest of German radio audiences. At the beginning of a feature story, the announcer would give the names of new prisoners in U.S. prisoner of war camps in a somewhat muffled voice, while mentioning that these names would be repeated at the end of the broadcast. This device kept listeners glued to the radio until the names were repeated quite clearly and the listeners could hear whether or not friends or family members were among those listed. The Sharpe students had to take turns doing these and other tasks and were subjected to sharp criticism by their fellow students and by Habe. Hannes Berger has commented that it was a hands-on training course like I had never experienced before. The lesson resembled that of a higher journalism academy. In print, as in broadcasting, everyone was trained on all aspects of text preparation, writing, style, and layout. As in broadcasting, work with print material began with the information given in the chief monitor's daily reports. Habe emphasized again and again that in writing stories, whether for broadcast or for print, one main idea should carry through the feature. Years later, the political scientist Konrad Kellen would recall how Habe always used to ask whenever anyone sought permission to print a pamphlet or a propaganda leaflet, "Where is the red thread?" The men learned that many of their propaganda leaflets and pamphlets would be printed on small sheets of paper so that they could be fired in artillery shells across German lines. The point was to encourage the German troops to surrender. The sheets should emphasize the good treatment that prisoners received in the American camps, the adherence there to the terms of the Geneva Conventions, the promise that they could communicate with their families by mail, and assurances that they would be returned home at the end of the war. These assurances were generally printed on the back side of the leaflet, along with instructions on how to surrender. The front sides should aim, as a rule, to be more sober and terrifying, and yet be simple but striking enough to have souvenir value. Habe noted that enemy soldiers have often kept a leaflet on this base, not using it immediately, but under pressure of later military events coming to present it as a meaning of entry into our lines. Before the Sharpe students composed their own leaflets, they were given examples to study and critique. One of these unsatisfactory examples contained 36 different violations of the principles of good propaganda. It began with the heading, "How much longer?" Wrong. One must not show impatience. And then said, "Tomorrow at 7:30, one must never prophesy. The 6th Parachute Regiment will disappear from the earth. One must avoid bombastic language. We have heard from one German prisoner, one must never use information obtained from fewer than 8, and one must say prisoner of war, not German prisoner. That you have received insufficient nourishment. One must not mention discomforts suffered by all soldiers," and so on. Here we see a good German propaganda pamphlet written by the German author Stefan Heim. Yes, this is the German one that was handed out. It pictures a typical American soldier who says he wants nothing more than peace, but that if the Germans insist on fighting, he will gladly use America's superior weapons to wreak havoc on the German troops. "Which Joe Jones do you want?" Heim asked. "A congenial American or a bitter enemy?" Habe taught his men to apply the same principles for addressing the enemy directly by loudspeaker at the front. As with pamphlets, one was constrained by time considerations, as it was extremely dangerous to speak for more than 90 seconds when one was vulnerable to gunfire and artillery shells out in front of the Allied lines. The soldiers at Sharpe practiced making these addresses as well. Occasionally, the Sharpe voice slipped up. The Czech actor Walter Kohner recalled that there were, quote, trucks with loudspeakers and transmitters parked behind our barracks, where we're testing the equipment, broadcasting within the confines of the camp. But once, one of the company's chief technicians accidentally transmitted on a frequency outside his range. The citizens of Gettysburg were mystified to hear orders over their radios delivered in German to surrender to the Americans. While Habe's students were learning all the ins and outs of propaganda, the other divisions, too, were active in their own fields. Under the instruction of the camp officers, the radio personnel tested and ordered their equipment. Lieutenant Arthur Jaffe remembers that, quote, 4 400-watt mobile transmitters were tested in code broadcasts from one to the other, the longest distance covered being the 20 miles between Camp Ritchie and Camp Sharpe. Once an antenna tower had been erected at the camp and the FCC had granted a frequency, the 1 kilowatt station played music for a day that could be picked up in the town of Gettysburg. Meanwhile, the printers at Camp Sharpe learned various printing techniques that could be applied to all types of war situations. They also received specialized training in Veritype printing. Of course, all the Sharpe men had to become familiar with a range of weaponry. Their commanding officer reported that, quote, the high point of this training was the day the company traveled to Ritchie to fire the M1 on the snowbound rifle range. Although the weather was freezing and a blizzard obscured the targets, over 90% of the men qualified. In reality, the scorers were remarkably generous. Albert Girard of the 2nd MRB was probably not all that atypical in his lack of prowess with rifles. Quote, I did pass the rifle range test that was mandatory prior to shipping overseas. Firing into the snow, I even had an astonishingly good score. My scorer, once the results had been officially recorded, told me I had in fact been hitting the wrong target. On their time off, the Psycho Boys visited the various establishments in Gettysburg. But because of the secrecy of the camp's mission, only the commissioned officers were allowed to go to the bars in town. Non-commissioned officers were not allowed to drink anywhere where there were women. But for nearly all the men, quote, when evening came, the men headed for Gettysburg, for relaxation and peace from the doggedness of army life. It was a 20-minute walk into town, and the men chose a variety of entertainments there. But because of the requirements for maintaining secrecy, there wasn't a lot of socializing between the MRB men and the townspeople. Ed Alexander remembers spending time in the town library and going quite often to the movies. Philip Pinkowski remembers the drugstore and soda fountain on the first floor of the David Wills house. The men visited the various town eating establishments, Mitchell's on the square, Lincoln Logs out on York Street, Ned's Place and Mrs. Smith's Restaurant on Chambersburg Street. Mrs. Smith's Restaurant was famous for its chicken dinners and its home-baked pies, and one could get an excellent meal there for $1. Some, but not all, took advantage of their location by touring the Gettysburg battlefield. Some of the men could claim ancestors who had fought there. Lieutenant Gordon Frick had an ancestor in the Union Army, while Lieutenant Gaston Pender could claim blood ties with a hero on the Confederate side. There were occasional special dinners and socials organized solely for the men at Sharpe. The beer flowed freely on these occasions, and the men frequently put on entertainment in the form of songs and skits. These socials were first held in the old Gettysburg Armory and later at the VFW post in town. Lieutenant Arthur Jaffe of the 2nd MRB fondly recalled Washington's birthday dance at the Gettysburg Armory, at which members of the company presented several original skits. Since women were present on this occasion, no beer was served. The later MRB companies could not use the armory for their banquets because a group of 50 German war prisoners were brought in and housed there. This made for odd exchanges whenever the men from Sharpe passed by it on their walks into town. Ed Alexander of the 5th MRB remembers the armory and the fence that surrounded it. Quote, I distinctly recall a metal fence upon which the German soldiers leaned and joked with us freely, with no U.S. guards in sight. They teased us about secrecy, adding that American soldiers who all spoke German surely had some purpose in their training at your special camp. Whenever they mentioned the camp, it was accompanied by a knowing smile. I cannot say whether any of our guys ever spilled the beans, but these POWs had either been captured or surrendered because of leaflets we were being trained to prepare. How ironical. In any case, we could never pass them on our way into Gettysburg without their hailing us in German. But I cannot believe they ever knew exactly what we were about. The main gathering place in Gettysburg was, of course, the Gettysburg Hotel. It was here the soldiers' families and friends came to stay. Igor Cassini's brother Oleg and Oleg's wife, actress Jean Tierney, came to visit while Igor was stationed here, and Igor's doting mother, the Countess Marguerite Cassini, moved to Gettysburg for the entire period her son was at Sharpe. After the hotel became too expensive for her, she took a room in Miss Gilliland's boarding house on Carlisle Street, but, quote, the Countess spent all her days in the hotel lobby, using the hotel stationery and having her mail delivered there. She had a small white bulldog named Cigarette, and often startled guests as she walked through the lobby calling, Cigarette, Cigarette, with her heavy accent. One gentleman apologized that he had no cigarettes, and she became highly insulted. Eventually, the Countess was evicted even from her boarding house when Miss Gilliland discovered that the Countess had stolen 2 steaks from her refrigerator for herself and her son. Many wives and girlfriends took semi-permanent residence at the hotel, particularly near the end of the training period. As a result, the men of Camp Sharpe fought for passes, even if only for a single evening. Stefan Heim recalled, quote, these long but oh so short evenings. People sit together in the dining room of the hotel, married couples and couples who don't yet have the official blessing, the men not acting very military in spite of their uniforms. One strives for a little festivity. The waiter has put candles on the table. The little flames flicker now and again, and when one of the women laughs, all too often it sounds forced. After dinner, they go to the room, take a bath, and sleep together until the phone jangles. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the hotel porter awakens the gentlemen soldiers. Not all the soldiers were fortunate enough to have their girlfriends so close at hand. Otto Scherpler spent most evenings in his barracks, writing love letters to Eva Marie Saint, his girlfriend at Bowling Green State University. Others waited eagerly for the much-coveted 2- or 3-day passes, when they could hitchhike to their homes or to a larger city. Every Saturday afternoon, a bus pulled up outside Camp Sharpe to carry men to the Harrisburg train station so that they could catch a train for all points east. Because the men at Sharpe were all pledged to extreme secrecy regarding their classes and their mission, it was difficult for any deeper relationships to form between the single officers and the women in Gettysburg. However, 2 officers did indeed marry local girls during their Camp Sharpe assignments. Lieutenant Clarence Ace Seaman of the 3rd MRB Company married Josephine Jo Howe, a teacher of commercial subjects at Gettysburg High School. Several months later, Lieutenant Gaston Pender, 4th MRB Company, married Catherine Dentler, a 6th-grade teacher at Gettysburg's Lincoln School. On Pender's wedding day, the camp cook sent some men out to polish up the name of Pender's ancestor on all the bronze plaques near the camp, so that, quote, when he came by with his bride, she could see it. Soon after Pender's wedding day, he was called to participate in the Allied invasion of Normandy, France. By the end of July 1944, the last soldiers had left Camp Sharpe for Europe. The 2nd and 3rd Mobile companies had left several months earlier. The wives and sweethearts had known of their early April departure before the Sharpe boys did, not because of a breach in security, but simply because the local tailor had mentioned to one of the soldiers' wives that he had to, quote, iron the uniforms of the officers because it's all starting up tomorrow. The first signs of departure at the camp had been 2 massive gleaming army trucks, one at each barracks of the 2nd and 3rd Mobile Broadcasting Companies. These were broadcasting and printing trucks, especially constructed for these units. It was, Leon Edel marveled, a corporation executive's dream, an assembly of transmitters, microphones, and printing presses ingeniously laid out within the narrow confines of the deluxe vehicles. The 2nd and 3rd MRBs crossed the channel with these trucks in the first days after D-Day. The 4th and 5th companies had a more hurried departure from Gettysburg. Hans Habe was transferred to London before their training was completed. The men of the 5th MRB Company took down the 80-foot antenna tower for shipment to France, and by mid-July the camp had emptied. The Gettysburg's newspaper Star and Sentinel reported, quote, "It's unfortunate that Gettysburg is to lose Camp George H. Sharpe. It was not a large camp, and there was little or no publicity attending its operation here. But to have several hundred men moving in and out of town every few months, and the occasional army vehicle passing through the streets, gave this historic little community a little touch of the war spirit." After the Camp Sharpe boys moved out of Gettysburg, the camp buildings were used to house German prisoners of war. It was becoming evident, even to the town of Gettysburg, that the European war had entered a new and crucial phase. After the war was over, the men of the 2nd MRBC held 3 reunions. The last of these was held on April 7, 1990, at Harvey's Chelsea restaurant in New York City, and it was organized by Psycho Boy Peter Wyden, who had become a well-known historian and author, and was the proud father of Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. 35 veterans came to the reunion. Men flew in from Florida and California, while the famous novelist Stefan Heim flew over from his home in East Germany. Other attendees were Eugene Fodor, who was the founder and franchise holder of Fodor Travel Guides, Glenn Birnbaum, the curmudgeonly owner of Mortimer's Restaurant in New York City, Conrad Kellen, a political scientist and research analyst at the Rand Corporation, David Berger, longtime host and producer of the radio programs Music from Germany and Germany Today. They came, a New York Times reporter wrote, as old men, shoulders stooped, smiling through wrinkles. They exchanged hugs, sipped drinks, and recalled that ancient and glorious time when they were brash young comrades in arms. Their arms were perfect fluency in German, a devilish knack for dirty tricks, and a fervent hatred of Hitler. Hans Habe had died, but a huge photograph of him hung over the bar as the men recalled their time in Gettysburg. Two of the camp alumni, who are now living in Germany, reflected on their time at Camp Sharpe. Ernst Kramer, a prominent German journalist, remarked that, quote, "Even though democracy had its roots in Europe, I learned practical democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, in Gettysburg." And novelist Stefan Heim echoed his thoughts, saying, "The ideas of Gettysburg have had an influence on my thinking up to this day. That speech of Lincoln's has never lost its meaning." As paragraph troopers, who chose words over rifles as their weaponry of choice, the Psycho Boys had fought to preserve ideals rather than to extinguish lives. Small wonder, then, that the muddy grounds of Gettysburg retained for them a lingering, if faint, utopian luster. This is the end of the formal presentation, but for those who are interested in visiting Camp Sharpe, there are photos of the site and where to find it. It is down a dirt road that goes off of Confederate Avenue, close to the North Carolina Monument. Until a year ago, the grounds served as a campground for young people who came there to study the Battle of Gettysburg. You can see that the campers did not encroach upon the old parade ground, which is marked by a flagpole and 2 rows of evergreens where the barracks had been. The flagpole is the only remnant from the camp that is left. I imagine that of the hundreds of people who drive down to this area, there is scarcely one who realizes that this is a significant World War II site. A small group of us is trying to change that, and we are hopeful that someday in the near future, a sign will be put up to mark the spot. And finally, if you want to learn more about Camp Sharpe Psycho Boys, I would urge you to get hold of a copy of my book. It is based on written memoirs, military documents, and interviews that I conducted with 11 of the men who were assigned to the camp here in Gettysburg. Thank you.
Beverley, my question to you is, how did you possibly conduct the research to get all the information that you have on this very secretive and classified project that was going on in Gettysburg? How did you do your research? Where did you find people, documents, etc.?
Well, I was lucky and I found veterans that could tell me things, but the most important part was to get hold of the instructional material and find out exactly what they did. And you know how in every class there's always one student who takes the best notes of anybody? Well, Ed Alexander, who was one of the ones that I interviewed, was the one who took the best class notes. And so he told me that what had happened is several years after the war was over, people from Fort Bragg came up and they asked him for his notes and if they could borrow them. And they took them. And he said he waited a couple of years and then he contacted them and said he'd like to have his notes back. And they said, well, you can't have them. It's classified material. And even though he'd written them. So after I interviewed him, I said, well, you've been so helpful to me and telling me so much about this stuff. Can I do anything to help you? And he said, yes, you can get me my class notes. And so I contacted the right people and found out that they had just been released from being classified. And so I got them back, got to use them, and then got to give them back to the vet that had written them.
Wow. Now, how about the veterans? Where were the veterans living, and how did you find them?
That was interesting too, because all sorts of interesting connections developed there. I talked to one that was a local history teacher in Maryland, and he told me that he had been in touch with the former head of his company. He was in the second MRB, and he had been in touch with Jaffe. And so I went on White Pages and found his phone number and called him. And then he mentioned other people. One I got actually through the film on the Ritchie boys. Cy Levin had been interviewed on that, so I was easily able to find him. It just sort of mushroomed from there. One of them was living in Switzerland, but was very, very helpful. But what was interesting to me was that finding all of these people created many reunions. I talked to one who had been a driver and worked in the motor pool. He said that he had just loved Jaffe, who was the commanding officer. So, and he said, could you say hello to him for me? And I said, sure. So next time I talked to Jaffe, I said, I just wanted to pass on greetings. And he said, oh, I remember him well. He said, do you happen to have any pictures of him? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay, good. So that was one interesting connection, to get the two of them together again. And then the other one was Cy Levin, who had written in his memoirs that he had shot someone. He had shot a prisoner of war. It was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Okay, I was talking again to this same commander who was so loved by everybody, and I said, why do you think it was? Why do you think it was that all the men talk about you with such affection? And he said, well, it's probably because one of my men accidentally shot a prisoner of war and was going to be court-martialed. And I stepped in and pointed out that the guy wasn't actually a prisoner. He was in the act of surrendering, but he hadn't actually crossed the lines. And so he got off for this. So I thought, this is a wonderful connection, too. And so it really was, I think, for the 11 men that I interviewed, it was almost like a fourth reunion.
Did you interview them here, or did you have to travel to go see them?
I did most of them by phone, some by letter. The driver, for instance, was in a nursing home, and he actually dictated a letter, told everything in that. Some I met. If they lived closely enough, then I could travel to see them. But I wish that I'd met the commanding officer of the Second Company, because I was on the line with him every couple of weeks. And I really wish that I'd bit the bullet and driven down to Florida and met him before he died. They're all gone now, by the way, except one. The one who had the class notes.
And tell me about Camp Ritchie, because you said that's been restored now.
Yes, that's wonderful good news. They now have a wonderful museum there called the Ritchie History Museum. They have all sorts of artifacts and things there. It's doing very well. I was down there last week, and it's a very small thing, just getting started. And the director said to me that day they'd had 50 people come through. So that's really very nice. And the man who's developing the whole Camp Ritchie project is talking now about giving them a much larger space so that they have a larger museum, archives, a library, and an auditorium. So if that goes through, this is really going to be very, very helpful.
Where is that located from here in Gettysburg?
It's in Cascade, Maryland. It's just across the border. It's about 20 miles. It's closest, actually, to Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, directly south from there.
Well, thank you for doing this program and sharing that fascinating story, and thank you for doing the research to make it come alive.
Thank you. It was fun.